Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's having a great time so far. I'd like to introduce you to we have two speakers for the presentation on oversized impact for nonprofits of all sizes. Our first speaker is Aziz Alghunaim, Chief Technology Officer at Tarjimly.
This is Umran Daknish and Alan Kurdi. Many in this room have probably seen these images of the Syrian boys. Images that shook the world. I remember the first feeling I had when I saw these pictures. I felt utterly helpless. Because I had watched this happen over and over again. My name is Aziz Alghunaim. I'm the co-founder of Tarjimly, which means translate for me in 12 different languages. Tarjimly is a platform that connects refugees and humanitarian workers with on-demand translators and interpreters. Our mission is to improve the lives of refugees and the efficiency of humanitarian services. Last year, a raft left the shores of Turkey seeking refuge in Greece, with 12 refugees on it. Unfortunately, the raft capsized, and everyone was at risk of drowning. Luckily, there was a Greek rescue boat that spotted the raft. Because the raft was in Turkish waters, their only course of action was to call the Turkish Coast Guard and report the rescue. The only problem here, no one on the boat spoke Turkish. This is the problem we're solving, the language problem. Refugees are trapped, not just by borders, but by language barriers every single day, preventing them from accessing critical services. You see, whether they're Syrian refugees, stateless Rohingya, or asylum seekers at the US border, all these people struggle to communicate with doctors, lawyers, NGO workers, or in this case, the Coast Guard. Language barriers are a critical challenge to any organization that serves a diverse community. Translators Without Borders reports that only 56% of refugees understand the materials they are provided. The UNHCR says that the complexity of working in multiple languages is a key challenge to field workers. And the Red Cross reports that speakers of a minority language are more vulnerable when a crisis hits because of the inability to communicate efficiently with them. If you work at an organization that serves a language diverse community, most likely you're very familiar with this problem. For example, an NGO that works in the United States that's helping an Afghani family resettle needs to make an appointment for them to go to the food bank. They will need a Dari interpreter, either in person or on the phone, just to take them out to get food. And unfortunately, machine translation services today are unreliable enough, especially for economically disadvantaged languages like Dari. So, on January of 2017, my MIT best friend and I started Tarjimly, an application that helps refugees and humanitarian workers communicate by connecting them with a volunteer interpreter in just 2 minutes. The refugee or humanitarian worker pulls out their phone, they select the language they need help with, in addition to any other requirements they need of the translator. Tarjimly will find and connect them with the best available translator to help them have a conversation. We use a range of inputs to find the best translator match for every request that comes to us. Let me share with you how we use machine learning to utilize and leverage our volunteer community. For each volunteer, we collect a range of metrics. Each metric informs us either about the volunteer's quality or availability. We use real user data to continuously update our knowledge about our users' skill level and quality, as well as their availability. Information such as their interaction pattern with us help us understand when is the right time to message out a request message to a volunteer. And peer-to-peer review sessions that happen after every interaction help us update our understanding of each volunteer's skill level and quality. Our machine learning models crunches all these numbers continuously and generates what we call a Tarjimly trust score. When we get a new request for help, we message out to a number of volunteers that have a very high Tarjimly trust score. This enables the humanitarian worker to get access to a high-quality translator within just 2 minutes. 10,000 volunteers signed up because now they can help a refugee right from their phone. And to date, they have helped more than 21,000 refugees and humanitarian workers. They have helped in everyday scenarios like speaking with the caseworkers, as well as some of the most critical scenarios a person can experience, like a medical emergency or trauma intervention. Tarjimly was there for a Congolese woman that waited months for her asylum interview, only to find out day of that her interpreter was unavailable. Tarjimly was there when Aisha, a volunteer translator, picked up the request from that Greek rescue boat. That day, it took Aisha just a few minutes to save 12 lives. The best part, she picked the request from her couch in her apartment in Los Angeles. I would like to introduce you to Aisha, one of the 10,000 heroes on Tarjimly. I have a short video of her speaking about her experience as a translator on Tarjimly. Also, Rafi is a British doctor that volunteered with the Boat Refugee Foundation in Greek refugee camps, and he'll be talking about his experience.
They were having a hard time even finding a phone number online because, none of those police departments have English language websites, obviously. I called around a little bit. I ended up calling a couple local police departments, and then they told me to call the military police, and I called them and gave them the coordinates and, relayed their contact information to the aid worker so they could check up on it and make sure that those people were rescued. So it was pretty mind-blowing. I was super floored. I still think it's really amazing. It's really inspiring. I care about what's going on in the world, but I think often, myself and maybe other people too, feel really helpless. And like anything you can do that is not really involved or requires a really huge amount of dedication is ineffectual, you know? And this is like the same level of effort, I feel like, as signing an online petition or something, but worlds more effective and dramatic. It's like forward thinking in the sense that you're working with people's current habits, you know what I mean? Yeah. I think a lot of the difficulty with trying to get people more involved in volunteer work or any kind of social justice work is just the barrier to entry. Like, you guys have lowered that so much. You can literally be sitting on your couch in your sweats and help someone across the world, and with knowledge that you already have, without, you know, having to go out of your way barely at all, which is incredible.
The situation where we were working, we were in a refugee camp with about 7,000 people, and the NGO I worked for mainly used volunteer interpreters, so they were refugees from the camp itself. And we tend to see about 100 people a night in our clinic, so it's quite a busy clinic. The conditions were not perfect. People were often waiting for quite a long time to see us, often queued for some time, you know, often very sick, and tensions were often quite high. And so often we were left, you know, with doctors and nurses who were free to do the job and see people, but limited by the amount of interpreters that we had. So having that extra resource was really, really useful. I think the other thing I found with the Tarjimly translators is that they were really good quality. And the majority of the Tarjimly translators were able to do that really well. And perhaps that's something about not being in the room, just translating the words that people say. I think one of the main things actually is, you know, we struggle with confidentiality, and people lose a lot of dignity in refugee camps, and having someone in there, I can think of a particular case where I saw a man who had an abscess in quite a private place, and he was quite embarrassed about showing us. And the ability to have, you know, I used Tarjimly and I had someone interpreted on the phone and where I could examine him, and not having to have someone who also lived in the camp in there as well was, I think, really valuable for him. And, you know, we were able to do a procedure and drain this abscess with that person on the phone, giving him, you know, reassuring him about what we were doing and explaining what we were doing without them being there. And I just suddenly had this realization that I was in Greece as a UK doctor, seeing a patient from Afghanistan that was being interpreted by someone speaking Farsi who was originally from Iran, who was living in Germany, and it was kind of emotional. And you know, the person left grateful at the end of it, and I was able to support them. And it wasn't a difficult or complex consultation, but I just thought that I just think it's a really, really good idea to be able to support people, and the fact that people are volunteering from you know, around the world who may or may not have been through the process that these people are going through, I think can be quite moving.
We believe these are solvable problems. There are 65 million displaced people in the world, but there are 3 billion bilinguals that are eager to help, just like Aisha. Half of the displaced population have internet and smartphone access, and that's only expected to grow, which makes accessing them possible. Imagine if every bilingual in the world can be trained and activated as an on-demand translator in a crisis. Imagine the power of that community. Tarjimly brings that community together and combines it with state-of-the-art machine learning that solves the complex translator matching problem. We match people across 23 time zones and 300 language pairs just within 2 minutes, because we're able to accurately predict the availability of our translators. Tarjimly is the world's most accessible translator service. So what's next for us? We plan to bring language access to 100,000 displaced people with the help of 1 million volunteers. What Wikipedia did for knowledge sharing, we want to do for humanitarian translation. We started with the Syrian refugee crisis, and we quickly learned that the best way to bring lasting impact is by supporting the humanitarian workers all over the world, have accessible translation. There are thousands of organizations, many in this room today, that are doing incredibly challenging and difficult work to serve the world's most vulnerable. Our goal is to enable them to do more. Refugees are so misunderstood that walls are being built, governments are shut down, and religious centers are attacked just to keep them out and silenced. I believe it's a human right to be heard and understood. And that's what Tarjimly fights for. I invite you to join our fight. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Patrick Baine, the Chief Data Officer at C4ADS.
So we conduct open source investigations driven by publicly accessible information. So what this means is we tend to, like I said, we're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we do research in transnational illicit networks. We do this primarily by conducting open source investigations driven by publicly accessible information. So these investigations are structured and analyzed using a network analysis tools to understand the convergence of illicit actors in the illicit space. So this analysis is primarily enabled through tech partnerships that we have with emerging tech partners. So one major partnership that we have is Palantir, which developed an application called Gotham that we use to structure sort of our network analysis. So you can see Gotham there is on the far left. So we use that to kind of look at the network structures and try and find convergence between different illicit networks. We also work with a ship tracking software called Windward, which uses AIS data to show real-time and historical movement of ships around the world. So you can see that that's in the center picture right there. And obviously another major partner for us is AWS. We've been using AWS to store all of our data, run our software and tools, and supplement our compute power in order to process the massive amount of data that we use to conduct our investigations. Our company is fairly small. We're about 25 analysts. We're young. We have a multilingual staff, which we use to conduct our investigations using a lot of primary source documents. So lastly, what we do is our mandate as an organization is to inform about the activities of illicit actors. This is what we exist to do. With both public and private dissemination of research and analysis, we attempt to inform the topic and push our capabilities to lead to any kind of action which disrupts the activities of illicit actors. So over the past few years, C4ADS has been assisting government partners, nonprofits, and multilateral organizations in getting a better understanding of how illicit networks work. Through this process, we've discovered that any type of illicit actor relies on the illicit system to operate. This means that whether it's a weapons trafficker, wildlife trafficker, or sanctions evader, they all need access to trade, finance, and transportation. So this interaction with the illicit system creates a digital footprint that C4ADS identifies, captures, and analyzes to create a real-world impact. And this use of the illicit system makes illicit actors vulnerable. Their resources are exposed to forfeiture or freeze, and their access can be restricted to the illicit system. For example, if an ivory seizure is made in Thailand, we're able to move from a bill of lading in Thailand to a trade record and then a shipping manifest in the source country. And this kind of helps us to identify the network on both the supply side and the demand side of the issue and find out what illicit actors are enabling this type of trade. So at C4ADS, we're structured in 5 teams. So we have things like environmental crime, which focuses on ivory, rhino horn, pangolin trafficking, and other wildlife trafficking. So this map right here, we work with the Routes Partnership, which looks at wildlife trafficking through the air transport sector. So this is the movement of ivory between 2009 and 2017. We focus on nuclear non-proliferation, includes things like sanctions evasions by the North Korean regime and dual-use good technology transfer. Natural resource exploitation includes things like IUU fishing and illicit timber and minerals trafficking. IUU means illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, and we actually released a paper this morning about the IUU networks. Organized crime and grand corruption includes things like human trafficking and Russian influence operations in Europe, and conflict finance and irregular threats includes issues like money laundering and arms trafficking. So the majority of C4ADS's analytic outputs directly support ongoing investigations. Direct investigative support is about 90% of what we do, and most of it does not see the light of day. We tend to work with enforcement organizations and NGOs that work directly on the issue, support their investigation however we can. So this includes things like dossiers. So dossiers are narratives of illicit networks in an investigation that outline judicially admissible and traceable data about a network that enforcement can essentially recreate and action upon. We also make network charts. I talked about Palantir earlier. So network charts are structured networks, structured Palantir Gotham graphs that people can view to understand sort of the convergence of these networks. And we also do sort of structured identifiers in tabular format so our partners can run bulk through their system. So our output really depends on what works best for our partner. We also release a lot of public-facing reports. There's a few of our more recent reports shown on the right here. We had a report a couple weeks ago that came out which looked at how Kim Jong-un acquired his 2 Mercedes and traced the trade from the Netherlands all the way to North Korea to kind of identify essentially that the sanctions regime has not been working. So we partner with credible organizations to counter illicit networks in any capacity. This includes law enforcement support, which is our primary mechanism of action against illicit networks. So using our cooperation with US and global law enforcement, we're able to provide information leading to sanctions, seizures, and arrests. This is our most direct way of confronting these illicit networks. So in the past 2 years, C4ADS has worked with, to some degree, with 64 law enforcement and IC organizations. We've contributed to 62 sanctions, 2,400 tons of illicit contraband seized, and $3.4 billion of criminal capital disrupted. We also partner with NGOs, journalists, and civil society to provide investigative support, advocacy, and training. And private sector engagement also allows us to be flexible with our approach to countering illicit networks. So we assist with the compliance efforts of banks and insurance providers, highlight red flags of illicit activity, and facilitate collaboration between institutions. So moving on. So that's who we are as an organization. That's kind of on a higher level. I'd like to kind of show off an analytical workflow and how we kind of incorporate all these different tools that we use to create sort of a global impact and expose these illicit actors. So for this example, in February 2019, during the Kim-Trump summit in Vietnam, we saw in windward a Vietnamese flag tanker named Viet Thanh 1 heading towards Nampo, North Korea. So this vessel set off a number of red flags, and so we see on the far left right there, that's its normal pattern of behavior, and its movement towards North Asia is the first time that it diverged from that pattern, and this set off red flags in our system and so that an analyst can kind of go in behind and see what's going on with this ship. We then checked, and while it was in Singapore, it actually reported via AIS for about an hour that it was going to Nampo, North Korea. Which somebody must have made a big mistake on board because they changed it an hour later. And then they changed it to report that they were going to Kaohsiung, Taiwan. So we looked in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, the port records for that day. It did not appear during that time period, even though that's what it was reporting on its AIS transmissions. And the speed of this analysis was all enhanced using our Elastic search engine built on AWS resources. So the vessel actually changed its reported destination to South Korea. We checked the port records there, didn't show up during that time period either. So 2 false destination reports were filed before it transmitted from Nampo Port. And actually when it arrived in Nampo Port, it turns off its transmitter, trying to obfuscate its activities, but it reemerged inside Nampo Port at an oil terminal in North Korea. And this is in direct violation of UN sanctions. We also worked with a media partner to obtain satellite images of the port at the time and identified a vessel that matched the physical characteristics of the Vietnam in North Korea during that time. So we decided to look back and see where it came from in Singapore. We looked back at the vessel at its origin, and it was docked at an oil terminal managed by a Singaporean company called Vopak Terminals. So this kind of analysis kind of serves as a lead for further investigation for our analysts to see how this particular network was able to exploit the international commodity supply chains in violation of international sanctions. So within 24 hours, we packaged all of our findings and worked with our media partners to publish an article which was picked up by international and local outlets, prompting the Vietnamese government as well as the United Nations to open inquiries into the vessel's network. So all this is kind of to show how we incorporate different sources of data and different tools to kind of create a short-term global impact on these illicit networks and disrupt their activities. So we're working to structure port records for jurisdictions all around the world and house these on our data lake in AWS. These records exist in all different types of formats, so having our Elasticsearch engine allows us to search through all of these records instantly and react to these events in real time. So this convergence between AIS transmissions, satellite imagery, and port records is a perfect example of our flexible strategy towards these issues. So AIS transmissions allow us to kind of track the voyages and trigger alerts whenever certain conditions are reached. Satellite imagery provides context on a vessel's activities at port and sea. And port and shipping records can provide context for cargo, ownership, and shipping agencies to then allow us to build out that illicit network and understand more about its operations. So about 3 years ago, we identified 3 main challenges as we were growing as an organization. We're up to about 35 now. When I started about 3.5 years ago, we had about 10 people. And so as we kind of grow, we encounter new challenges with how we approach data analysis and how we approach these investigations. So one of these challenges is what we call horizontal data visibility. Our work is founded on the ethos that illicit networks are transnational in nature and often touch one another. Finding these nexuses is integral to our work. So unburdened by the compartmentalization challenges that government and enforcement faces, we needed to find a way to ensure that analysts had a way to maintain visibility across analytical projects, even as our organization grew. So, for example, even if somebody is searching for an IV trafficker in a Kenyan registry, they're able to search through all data sets across all investigations. So even though this guy might own a company in Kenya, it'll still ping that he owns property in Dubai, even though those investigations are completely unrelated. Another challenge was vertical data visibility. So analysts needed a way to view deeper into the data that they had. We often receive large data sets of scanned documents that analysts would have to pore through by hand, often missing key information. We needed a way to address those restrictions and enable analysts to essentially do more with less. And lastly, disparate data integration. Analysts were searching through data sets one by one and manually identifying connections across these data sets. We needed a way to conduct advanced searches and entity matches across all of these data sets at once, so that analysts can do what they do best, which is analyze. So in response to these challenges, C4ADS worked to improve its data operations across 3 main verticals. So the first is data access. So this is how we acquire information as an organization. Data integration, how we bring this data into our organization, clean it and enrich it, and then prepare it for the third step, which is our bread and butter data analysis. This is the heart of what we do, and this is what helps us reach the actionable outcomes against these illicit networks. So for the first data access, we've significantly increased our collection of large, high-advantage data sets. High-advantage are things that we identify as, benefiting these larger investigations. Like I said, we have, for example, the Dubai property registry. There's a couple examples on here, Russian corporate registry, Iranian company announcements. These are things that can benefit across all of our investigations. So we call these high-advantage data sets. However, in many countries where we actually do our research, these records are not digitized in any way. So we've been working to expand our outreach using consultants to go and digitize and process physical records that aren't available otherwise. This includes things like going with a little hand scanner into a port and scanning hundreds of thousands of documents that were just stacked on top of each other. This gives us access to information that wouldn't otherwise be available. And finally, we work to streamline partner engagement and data integration by developing tools to streamline data sharing and outreach. This includes a secure file sharing platform that's currently under development using AWS resources, which we've dubbed Sub Rosa. This will facilitate the data transfer and outreach to compliance, banks, and insurance companies. So data access. Integration, sorry. This is how we get data into our internal system. So we've made vast improvements to data ingestion pipelines ranging from bulk data collection, so web scrapers, individual record pools from consultants, and external databases from partners or data vendors. All this data is stored on AWS in AWS Cloud Storage. And then once the data is in AWS, we can begin to enrich that data through a series of processes. So we use things like optical character recognition, indexing, and natural language processing to make this data searchable in our data lake system. So even scanned documents, we're able to use OCR to then make those searchable through our data lake Elasticsearch system. We also use Python and R for data enrichment and processing to prepare the data for bulk analysis. This capability has enabled analysts to find matches between large, unruly data sets that were never meant to talk to one another. We're able to ingest and process messy data sets and prepare them for bulk analysis within days. All this activity is facilitated and enhanced using AWS compute and storage capacity. So this brings us to our final component, which is analysis. In order to address the challenges we mentioned earlier, we adapted multiple systems for analysis. I've referenced this a couple times, but we created an Elasticsearch system that we call Seamless Horizons. This platform serves as a central repository for all of C4ADS's data, allowing analysts to conduct advanced full-text searches across all these data sets within milliseconds. So we're currently up to, these numbers are slightly old, but 104 registries that account for more than 350 million records. We're also developing a flight tracking software operating on AWS compute and storage tools, which incorporates pattern recognition and machine learning to track flights and alert users to patterns and activity using data collected by our network of ADSB receivers. We're doing this because the publicly accessible websites like Flight Radar scrub data at the owner's request. So the most interesting aircraft used by kleptocrats get automatically scraped by these websites, no questions asked. So those are the flights that we want to see in our research. And so we've been shipping off ADSB receivers all around the world to especially jurisdictions of interest, so that we can see what kind of activity is going on in the air around those areas, places like North Korea and South Sudan. So again, these platforms and all of their data are housed on AWS and secured using AWS encryption and user authentication. And for any solutions architects out here, this is our data lake solution architecture. And for us, the beauty of this platform is in its simplicity, and this is what allows us to scale globally and bring on organizations onto this platform. And last, I have a short video here that kind of shows an analytical workflow. So this is started from an OFAC sanctioned network. The former vice president of Venezuela had all of his companies and one of his aircraft sanctioned. And the US government found one plane, but we decided to see if there was more to it. So perhaps we could actually get this started. We'll see. Any luck? Hey, there we go. Okay. Well, it's a silent video, but it kind of shows how we incorporate different data sets to do our analysis. So So this is us working back from the sanctioned plane to see what other planes are in this network. So this is how the analytical workflow looks like in Palantir. And you can see the red entities on this graph are the ones that were not sanctioned by the US government, likely because they didn't know that they existed. So you see across the top right there, those are the aircraft that were not sanctioned. So this also incorporates our flight data that we've been collecting. So you can see a little bit how that fits into this type of workflow. Again, like I said, commercial platforms scrub the data. So we looked, wasn't there on those platforms. I think they're looking on flight radar here. And so our ADSB receivers, we work with a company called ADSB Exchange, and they were able to pick up the fact that planes owned by this sanctioned individual were still operating in and out of Miami even after the sanctions occurred. So again, these are serious national security risks that should be highlighted, and our methodology kind of helps highlight these issues. Okay, and that's it for me. Thank you, everybody.